Have you ever started something and didn't finish it? Something major, something important to you? Have you ever started something and it took a lot longer to finish than you anticipated? Have you ever started something and you had trouble finishing it, sticking with it? But maybe you're one of those people that started something and it took a lot longer to finish than what you thought. You started something, you thought you would be finished in a short period of time, but it ended up being in a long period of time, but you finished it. And I think that if you look back on how you finished it, you will see God working in your life. And when you finally finish that college degree, or you finish that training, or you finish that test, or that project, or that ministry, or wherever it was, or that career, yes, it took a lot longer than what you thought, but you look back and you say, God was working in my life. And because you know God was working in your life, you can praise the Lord. You can give him glory because you look back. If it had not been for God, I wouldn't have finished the assignment that I was given. Today, we're going to meet some Jewish people who started something, had trouble finishing it. The enemy came upon them, and yet in the end, they finished it. And when they finished it, they gave praises to God. Stay tuned for this week's lesson. It's going to be fantastic. Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. John W. Wilson III, bringing you the Sunday School lesson for this week, March the 13th, 2022. The title of the lesson is called Free to Worship. Free to Worship. It will come from Ezra chapter 6. We'll look at verses 1 through 12. Ezra chapter 6, verses 1 through 12. But before we get started in this great lesson, I want to invite you to like, share, or subscribe to this YouTube channel. Share with it many people as possible if you find this lesson is a blessing to you. Also, if you like to, and I would appreciate it very much, if you left a comment in the comment section telling me what you learned from this lesson or what you want to add to this lesson or how you feel about the lesson. That would be a great help and encouragement to me. So let's get right into this lesson, Free to Worship. We have studied, this is the third time in about a month and a half that we've studied Ezra. Last time we studied chapter 1 and then a little bit of part of chapter 2 at the end of chapter 2. Now we're going to go to chapter 6. But let's get a good context of what's happening. Let's find out what's happening from chapter 3 to chapter 6. And so to do that, all you have to do is open up your Bible. This is a narrative. Ezra's a narrative. Remember, the first 6 chapters is written by someone else other than Ezra. It recounts the history up until Ezra's arrival in chapter 7. Chapter 7 through 10 is Ezra's personal testimony, his memoirs of his ministry. If you remember, the setting, the big setting is the people from Judah and Benjamin. They had been placed in exile for 70 years. Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian nation army conquered them, took the people of Israel, those 2 tribes primarily, into captivity for 70 years. And as Jeremiah prophesies, God will release them. And so God has released them. He raised up a power under King Cyrus. King Cyrus conquers the Babylonian nation, subdues them, and then the first thing he does, the Bible says he was stirred up, and the people were stirred up, And so he stirs him, God stirs him up in a way, moves upon him in a way that he announces the decree that all those who are in exile, who want to go home to their promised land, to Israel, to Judah, are free to go. Not only are they free to go, the people that are in exile that will stay will finance that trip. And that the people there will also contribute to the building of the temple. So King Cyrus frees them up on the moving of the Lord to rebuild the temple in Judah. And he provides financing along the way. Financing for the people to make this long trip, and financing for that temple to be rebuilt. And so that's chapter 1 and 2. At the end of chapter 2, it tells us over 42,000 people decided to come to rebuild this temple, a remnant of the people of Israel. They were stirred up by the Lord himself, by God himself, to come, and they make this trek from Babylonia to Judah. And so now that brings us to chapter 3. I encourage you to read chapters 1 through 6. It's a very enriching read, very fast, has a heavy in content, and that will help you understand this lesson in its entirety. And so let's look at chapter 3. So the people are there. This is around 538 BC. The Persian army under Cyrus had conquered Nebuchadnezzar in 539. So in the second year of Cyrus, he announces proclamation and the people leave. So the first thing they do when they get to Judah, they erect an altar and they begin worshiping God through animal sacrifice. Everything is going well. Now they erect an altar. Now they're preparing to rebuild the temple. And so in chapter 3, it says this: now in the second year after they're coming to the house, after they're coming to the house of God at Jerusalem. So that puts us at 537. The second year, 537. In the second month, Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, he is now the governor of Judah. One thing about Cyrus, if you remember, he had a very kind heart. He allowed them to establish their own, go back home and have their own sense of order. He did have an overseer. He did do this because he wanted to keep peace in his territories. He didn't want uprisings here and there. So he felt that if he would honor and respect their religious beliefs, their act of worship, that would bring peace. And the other thing, remember, he was polytheistic, meaning that he worshiped many gods. Marduk was his supreme god, but he respected and wanted the blessings from other gods, especially the gods of the nations that he conquered. And so although he spoke well of the God of Israel, he was not a believer, but he wanted the blessings from the God of Israel. He wanted the people to pray for him and his sons that he would continue to do the things that he's doing. So we have 537. The people began to rebuild the temple of God. And the first thing you do anytime you build anything is that you lay a foundation. And so the people are working hard in this second year that they're back, and they begin to build this foundation. And the Bible says that all the people came together and they built this foundation. They built this foundation. And it was a large foundation, but the Bible tells us that there were many people who praised the Lord, but in the midst of it, there were people who were crying out because they had remembered the foundation or the size of Solomon's temple, and that they knew that this temple was going to be nothing like Solomon's temple. And so in the midst of the shouting and praising, they were crying and weeping, but the joy of the people who had not seen Solomon's temple drowned out the weeping and crying of those who had witnessed Solomon's temple. So that's what we have here. The foundation is laid. Now we have to understand that when we're doing God's work, when God is giving you an assignment to do, things don't always go so smoothly. In fact, most of the time they do not. And so it's a spiritual warfare goes on. Satan's going to raise up people to oppose God's work. They're going to be people that are jealous, that are envious, that just don't like what you're doing, and they're going to do everything they can to stop it. And if you know anything about church, there will be people in the church that will try to stop it with their negativity, but there will also be people in surrounding communities looking on what you're doing and not happy, and they'll try to discourage people from completing that project. They will talk about it. They will spread rumors. They will lie. They'll do anything to stop the rebuilding. And so what we have here in chapter 4 is that the foundation is built. As they begin to build the temple, adversaries come and try to discourage the people. In fact, they're Samaritans and neighboring nations that do not want to see a strong Israel, do not want to see Israel get restored to his glory days. And so the Samaritans first, they don't call them Samaritans, but I'm assuming that's what they are, because the Samaritans, you got to remember, they were part Assyrian and part Jewish. And so they had a sense of worship of what the Jewish people did, even though it was not exactly, it was kind of blended in with the Syrian worship. Even though they had their own Bible, it wasn't quite the same Bible as the Hebrew Bible, but they understood enough. And so they offered, I think, with evil intentions to help Zerubbabel and the rest of the people build this temple. And I believe that God laid it on Zerubbabel's heart to reject the offer that these Samaritans and other nations were offering. And that's exactly what he did. He said, they asked, let us build with you. And then Zerubbabel responds back and says, you have nothing to do with us in building a house to our God. But we alone will build to the Lord, the God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. Okay, and then what it says here, then the people of the land discouraged the people of Judah and made them afraid to build. They threatened them, they talked about them, they told lies about them, and it discouraged the people to build. And it also says here, they bribed counselors against them to frustrate the purpose all the days of King Cyrus, all the days of his reign, all the way up to Darius, the king of Persia, which is chapter 6. Okay, for a very long time, 20 years, there was opposition of building this temple. People were trying to frustrate what God was trying to do. And I'm trying to say is that when you do something for the Lord, when you do something that's worthwhile, there will be opposition. And that opposition does not necessarily go away. You may have to learn to live with it and learn to deal with it. But there will be opposition. But if you're doing what God's will is, what God has called you to do, if God has called you to excel in your job, if God has called you to go back to school, if God has called you to go to seminary, if God has called you to preach, teach, serve in whatever capacity he has called you to do in God's kingdom, guess what? If you stay with it, if you remain faithful, you will prevail. God will prevail. Just remember, whatever you do for the Lord, no matter how great it is, there will be devils coming after you. There will be devils that will come after you in the name of Jesus with the willingness to help all along trying to sabotage you. So don't think it's going to be a piece of cake. Don't think it's going to be easy. Just know that if you stay with God, stay focused, stay faithful, have the right people around you, guess what? You will achieve what God has called you to achieve. You will be, it may be fearful at times. It may be that you do this part and another generation finishes it. But you will succeed. So stay faithful in the midst of spiritual warfare. Stay faithful. Trust God. He is bigger than those devils. He is bigger than those who come against you. They may think they are winning, but God's going to take that what they're doing to make you even stronger and for him to receive even greater glory. So They discourage him, but this is what happens later. They contact the current king. Okay, King Cyrus is no longer king. He may be older in age, he may be ill, but King Artaxerxes is now the king. Okay, he is the king. So what happens is that these same naysayers, these same people that don't like what Israel is doing, they write a letter to King Artaxerxes against Jerusalem, telling them that they're building this temple for the wrong reasons. If you look at chapter 4, it says that if they build this temple, they're going to withhold the tribute. And it's another thing they said, if you build this temple, they're going to dishonor you. You're not going to get the respect that you need. If you build this temple, they're going to make a rebellion like they did before in Babylon. If you build this temple, they will take over this entire area. That's what they're telling them. And so they're encouraging them, this king, not to let them finish this temple, not to let them do what they're doing, to stop them in their tracks. And so this king was not moved by God, was not stirred by God. He was not in the same demeanor or likeness of King Cyrus. He writes a letter telling the people of Jerusalem that their work must cease and that it must cease immediately. Okay, so they have the foundation laid, probably done in the first year. And the Bible tells us that this foundation lays dormant for about 16 years. The people get discouraged. They go about their business. They start building their own houses, start building their own luxury houses, start worrying about their accumulation of wealth, and they lose focus on what God has called them to do. If you want reference on that, you look at Haggai and Zechariah. They give you a climate of what happens during the 16 years. They give up and they forget about it, and they go about their business, and they lose track of the Lord. They don't pay attention to the Lord. They don't worship God anymore. They're all about materialism. That's what happens for 16 years. Okay? 16 years. At the end of 16, God raises up Haggai and Zechariah. Zerubbabel is the governor. Haggai preaches them and tells them, you see why bad things are happening to you now? You have built your houses, but God's house, the house of the Lord, lays in waste. You have your house built with the finest of woods, spared no expense, but look at God's house. And then Zechariah preaches that if you only repent, if you get back to the Lord will come back to you. And sometimes we got to remember, when we get discouraged, when there's spiritual warfare, when we get on, our assignment gets placed on pause, that is not a time to turn our backs on the Lord. That is not a time to drift away from the Lord. In fact, what it is, we should plant our feet deeper into the ground and say, Lord, I don't know what's going on. I know I'm in a pause. As my former pastor used to say, I'm in a holding pattern. But I'm going to stay faithful and true to you until you tell me when I can land, when I can plant my feet and move on. But these Jewish people, they got caught up in the world. Their eyes start venturing off. They let the opposition discourage them, defeat them, turn their backs on the Lord. And God sends these prophets. Zechariah is a prophet and a priest. Send these people to get them back connected with God, to bring a sense of conviction to their heart to do the right thing. And the people respond. It says, then the work of the house of God, that is Jerusalem, stopped. And it ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Stayed dormant for 16 years. 16 years. Until the reign of King Darius, to the reign of Darius, the king of Persia. And so the issue is that what has happened is this temple that which should have been built in about 4 years, nothing happened or opposition happened for 20 years. This temple went 20 years without being built. Without being built. And so in 520 BC, the people under King Darius of Persia start rebuilding the temple. Let's look at verse 5 and get a little bit more background information. And so they start, it's just dormant under Haggai. They start trying to rebuild the temple. The officials in Persia that are overseeing them, we'll see in verse chapter 5, his name is Tatanea. He's a governor of the province beyond the river, meaning that he is a representative of Persia. He is designed to overlook and see what that territory is doing. And he notices that the people have started again to rebuild this temple, or started rebuilding a temple that he knew nothing about. He knew nothing about the decree from Cyrus. He knew no reason why they would start building. And so what he does as a good official, a good representative, he goes and asks them why they're rebuilding the temple. What are they doing? And so so they give them a feedback, and they say that the Lord has told us to do this. And they tell them that we received way back when a decree from Cyrus, king of Persia at that time, that we are to rebuild this temple. And they tell them that. They tell them we're doing what God has told us to do, but also we're doing what we had permission to do, which was from King Cyrus. Okay? All right? And that's going to be in chapter 5 where they had this conversation. He said, and then he gets the names of the people in charge, and this guy has to make a report back to Artaxerxes, or Darius, of what is happening. Okay? And so what he does is that now he writes a letter to King Darius the First. And he talks about his interaction with these people. And he's telling them what they're doing. He says, be known to the king that we went to the province of Judah, to the house of the great God. It is being built with huge stones and timber laden walls. They're rebuilding the temple. The work goes on diligently and prospers in their lands. They're making progress, okay? Then we asked the elders and spoke of them thus: who gave you the decree to build the house and to finish this structure? We also asked them to name the names for your information, that we may write down the names of their leaders. Now, this official is not trying to hate on them. He's not trying to stop them. He doesn't know what's going on, but he's just making a report. And this was their reply: we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth. We are rebuilding the house that was built many years ago with a king of Israel built and finished. That means that Solomon had built this temple. They're rebuilding what Solomon had done. But because of the fathers and anger to God of heaven, he gave them in the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. Gives them a history of what's going on. Okay? Then he says, however, in the first year of Cyrus the king of Babylon, the king made a decree to this house that this house of God should be rebuilt, and the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken out, should be placed back in this temple. Okay? And he says, then this Shalbazzar came and laid the foundation of the house of God that is in Jerusalem. And from that time on until now, it has been in building and is not yet finished. Therefore, if it seems good to the king, let's search and be made in the royal archives there in Babylon to see whether a decree was issued or not. So this guy says, king, go look and verify this story. See if King Cyrus made this decree, and then you tell me how you want to act in this manner. So now we go to chapter 6. It says this: then Darius, the king, made a decree, and search was made in Babylon. Babylon is modern day Iraq. Persia is modern day Iran. So a search was made in modern day Iraq, Babylonian, in the house of the archives where the documents were stored, and in Ecbatana, the citadel that is in the province of Media, which is northwest Iran. A scroll was found in this place, not Babylon. A scroll was found on which it was written, a record in the first year of Cyrus the king. Now what he has is a written record of Cyrus the king. What we have in Ezra 1 is an oral account. And what we have here is an excerpt from this written record. So it's more exhaustive than what we have in Ezra 1. That's why it's not quite the same, because this is from the written decree. What we have in Ezra is what was given orally. So the written decree has much more detail, but what we have here, the king has found this. He's giving it back to this official, and he's giving them an excerpt of what he needs to know and how to move forward. So he says this, the king, it says, a record in the first year, Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered, and let its foundations be retained. Its height shall be 60 cubits, and its breadth 60 cubits, and with 3 layers of great stone and 1 layer of timber. Giving them how it should build. It's going to be a place where it's going to be stone on the outside and have timber on the inside, wood paneling on the inside. The people had already started building it with these huge stones, and so they're following what King Cyrus had given them permission to do. Now this is what he says right here. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasure. In chapter 1 it says that the people would help pay for it, but in the written decree it seems as though this was added, that let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. And also let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple, thus is in Jerusalem, be brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple that's in Jerusalem. So now he's restating that what Nebuchadnezzar had took out their temple be put in there. So he's conferring on this written decree what the elders, the leadership at that time, told this official, in which the official told King Darius, each to his place, you shall put them in the house of God. Now, this is what the decree, what he read to them. Now, this is what King Darius says to them. Now, therefore, based on this, Tataniah, governor of the province beyond the river, okay, and your associates and governors who are in the province beyond the river, look what he says, keep away, let the work on this house of God alone. He said, keep away, let the work on this house of God alone. Meaning that leave this, don't mess with them, don't interfere with them, let them do what they have to do. They're not to be disturbed, they're not to be interrupted in any kind of way. So he said, leave them alone, let them do what they want to do. See how God is? God is making a way after 16 years of isolation. After 20 years of struggle, God is making a way. No matter what struggle you and I go through, we cannot give up on God. It may not happen the way we think it ought to happen. It may not work according to plan. But God can do the miraculous. God can take opposition and make that opposition work on your behalf. Those people that we heard of about from Artaxerxes, 16, we don't hear about them anymore. They're gone from the scene. In fact, God makes a decree from King Darius, who is very similar to King Cyrus in his heart, or being moved by God, says, let nobody mess with them. They're speaking to people in Samaria and all these surrounding nations that don't like Israel. God will fight your battles. All we have to do is be obedient. Let God fight your battles. Our job is to remain faithful and do what God has called us to do. God has called you to go to school, go to school. God has called you to work hard on your job, work hard on your job. God has called you to be over this ministry, be over this ministry. Let God fight your battles. You keep your eye on the prize, and you don't get distracted, and you don't get discouraged. That's what he's telling us. God can use secular people or anybody that he wants to be a blessing to you. God can do that. God is in control. His sovereign. Look how God is working this out. The people here, they don't have to lift a finger or fight a battle. All they have to do is do what God has told them to do, and that's rebuild the temple. God doesn't even have to tell them what to say. The king Darius is speaking on behalf of God. God is using him and his authority to get his job done. Even though Darius is not a believer, just like Cyrus. He's polytheistic. He has his own God, Marduk. But he respects other gods, and he wants blessings from other gods, and he wants his nations that he conquers to have their own sense of worship so trouble won't be started. All right? So he says here, it says, let the governor of the Jews, that's Zerubbabel, and the elders of the Jews rebuild his house on its site. Moreover, I make a decree regarding what you shall do for these elders of the Jews for the rebuilding of the house of God. Okay? Now he's changing what was done in chapter 1. Chapter 1, the people that was in exile that remained helped fund the project. And the people that were already in Judah helped fund the project. But look what he says here. The cost, this is over begone. The cost is to be paid to these men in full and without delay from the royal revenue. So not that the people are going to pay for the temple to be built. He's going to take it from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province beyond the river. All Samaria and all those surrounding nations, as well as Judah and Benjamin, southern Israel, the southern kingdom of Israel, the tribute that they were going to pay to Persia, to King Darius, he's going to use that money to rebuild the temple. All those haters that were coming at them and discouraging them, he's going to take their money and help rebuild his temple. See how good God is? See what God does? He'll make your enemies your footstools. He'll make your enemies be your footstools. That's what he does here. This temple of rebuilding is basically free to them. Unlimited resources, all the resources that they need being provided to make sure that this temple is going to be built. Look what he says here. He's not done yet. And whatever is needed, bulls, rams, or sheep for burnt offerings. He not only is going to supply the needs to build a temple, he's going to supply the animals to be sacrificed for burnt offerings. Now this is in that day, sacrifices were common throughout pagan nations too, but they sacrificed for the wrong reason. They wanted to appease their God, or they wanted to manipulate their God, or they were trying to get something from their God. Well, the Jewish people, they did sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins, and it was part of their worship to God. And God is using a pagan person, king, to supply the animal sacrifices. It says bulls, rams, and sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven. He's recognizing their God. He's not a believer, but he's recognizing their God. And he's saying the words that the Jewish people want him to say. And then he says wheat, salt, wine, and oil. These were things used in certain types of sacrifices, grain sacrifices or animal sacrifice. He's giving them everything that they need down to the detail. And this decree, it seems as though he's getting aided by Jewish people because it's very exact, very precise, and very Jewish that a pagan king would not know. He would not know about the salt, wine, and oil. Okay? As the priests at Jerusalem require. He wouldn't know what they require unless somebody told them. So God is allowing the Jewish people that are in Babylon, or where the king is reigning, to give input into his decree. Okay? All right. It says, let that be given to them day by day without fail. So the surrounding nations are to supply these animal sacrifices for as long as needed. That's amazing. God is taking the hate, using it for good, changing that situation around, making it work out for good. that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. Only thing the king wants in his return is that they pray for him, that he has blessings from their God, okay? That they be content, that they be peaceful. All he wants to do is that have your God pray for me, because I want blessings from your God. And I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, he's speaking to the haters. He's speaking to the naysayers. He's speaking to the people that don't like what's going on. A beam shall be pulled out of his house, and he shall be impaled upon it, meaning that he will be killed. A beam will take it from his house, and he will be pinned or asphyxiated to that beam on display to show people what happens to those who go against my edict. And his house shall be made a dunghill, meaning that his house shall be torn down and made into a pile of crap. May the God who has caused his name to dwell here overthrow any king. He said, may God of Israel. I mean, he's praying the right prayer, saying the right words. Overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand or alter this or destroy the house of God and destroy. He's saying that anybody touches this, may the God of Israel put his hand on them and destroy them. Boy, those Jewish people had great influence, and God opened up Darius' heart to listen to him. God moved on him. I, Darius, make a decree. Let it be done with all diligence. Do this now. Act accordingly. For 20 years, that place, the temple was not built. 16 of those years, the foundation lay barren, looked terrible. People had to walk by and see a foundation that looked terrible, weathered away, beaten away. And the problem was, but they did not understand at that time, that was what the world saw of their God, a foundation that lay in ruins. And God raised up Haggai, Zechariah, Zerubbabel to give leadership, conviction to have that temple built. That temple started in 520 BC. It was built 4 years later in 516 BC. When it was built, God received the glory. His name was praised. God was lifted up. What do we learn about this? We serve a great God. Things will be tough in our lives. Things will not happen as smoothly as we think. I was talking to my pastor. We were just talking about things, and we just came to the conclusion. We were sharing things. Something always happening. Something always coming up. There's always a stumbling block of some sort. Sometimes when you think you're going smooth, there's always a stumbling block. And God uses those stumbling blocks. What? Not to discourage you, but to encourage you to depend on Him even more. Sometimes when things happen so smoothly, we forget about God, or we don't give the God the praise that He's due, the justice that He's due. It's that when we have stumbling blocks, God keeps those stumbling blocks, those haters coming into our lives, those setbacks in our lives, so we can keep our eyes focused on Him and understand that where our power comes, where our success comes, it is from God only. All good things come from God. And we have to understand that it doesn't come from us. And God now has set the stage for Ezra to arrive on the scene, for religious reform. The people here have been in bondage for 70 years. Or those who had remained in Judah had been without priests and Levites for 70 years. They had lost certain customs and traditions. They forgot how to worship God. God is restoring worship back in Judah. Now He's raising up a priest that will teach them religious reform, that will teach them about the traditions and the law, that will prepare them a way to accept the coming Messiah and to live as a holy people until He comes. God has a plan. God is working it out. Don't get discouraged. God is in control. No matter what's happening in your life, Do not get discouraged. God is sovereign. He's providential, meaning that whatever his purposes are is going to happen and no one can stop it. And remember what Job said, nothing can thwart the plans of God. And what he's saying is this: I went through all this suffering. I don't know what's going on. I don't know why this is happening to me. And God never told Job why this was happening to them. All God asked Job to do was to trust him. And at the end of him trusting him, God restored him what he had before, twice as much, tenfold. He was much more wealthier at the end than he was at the beginning. Yes, he had lost his children, but God gave him 10 more children. So he had 20 more. And that's what God is happening here. They were in exile, lost everything. Judah had been destroyed, burnt up, nothing there, living in poverty. And God set the stage to restore Jerusalem back to a place of worship. And in the midst of that, changing the people's heart. Changing the people's heart where they wanted to worship him. And the good news is that when the people came out of exile, it was no more idol worship. They worshiped the one true living God. All that idol worship, God had purified them or cleansed them of these idol worship. Never to happen again. That's how good God is. Don't let stumbling blocks bother you. Don't let delays set you back. Don't let naysayers discourage you. You keep your eye on what God has called you to do, and you do it. And you do it well. And you give God the glory. And whether on this side of heaven or the next side of heaven, you'll look back and you'll see how great God is. You'll see how God moved in your life. You'll see how God brought people in and out of your life to achieve not your purpose, but his purpose. And you'll see how God used you and many other people in ways unimaginable. God is using you right now in ways that you have no idea that you cannot see. God is using you by the words that come out of your mouth in ways that you cannot even imagine. Several months ago, I prayed with a gentleman that was having family issues. And I prayed with him, and I talked to him, and I counseled with him. And I left there, I felt that I had done nothing to help this individual. I felt like I was discouraged. I felt that I had done nothing to make him want to reconcile his situation. I had left there thinking about, God, there's nothing I can do. I just don't think I'll make it. But this man called me back and told me that the words that I said to him motivated him to reconcile that family relationship, to go back and look at the error of his ways. I thought I had done nothing. And that was me being discouraged on my own mind. But God can take words that we think are nothing and use it to accomplish his glory and be a blessing to somebody else. Don't get discouraged. Stay in the fight and watch what God will do. Well, I hope this lesson has been beneficial to you. I hope that it'll help you in your preparation for your study on Sunday morning. I hope that you see the picture of what God's providence is like. We don't know what's going on, but God does. Our job is to trust. So I will talk to you next week. God bless you. I love you so much. Have a great Sunday. Have a great Sunday school. I hope you're back worshiping together. God bless you.